Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for the International Biochar Initiative and US Biochar Initiative webinar focused on biochar's wildfire mitigation potential in the Pacific Northwest. And we're really pleased and grateful to have our colleagues from C6 Forest to Farm to join us to share their experiences. This webinar is being recorded and we will share it afterwards with everyone who registered as well as on social media, etc. Before we get into the topic at hand, very briefly, I'd like to share a little bit about the International Biochar Initiative and also set the stage for today's topic. In case you're not familiar with our organization, IBI is a membership-based organization. We have a little over 400 members based in 70 countries, and we were founded in 2006. IBI primarily focuses on advocacy for and education about biochar systems for agriculture, the built environment, environmental remediation, water filtration, and all of the many sectors that biochar plays a strong role in. Before I hand it over to the moderator for today, Miles Gray of the US Biochar Initiative, I wanted to mention a couple events that we have upcoming in the fall. One will be in October in Italy, and we're going to have all of the links for these will be put into the chat. This will be a study tour or a hands-on, interactive, and collaborative tour through places that are using or making biochar in the vineyards in Tuscany. We also are co-hosting the German Biochar Forum in November, and we'll have a link to our full event calendar, which also includes the many, many biochar and adjacent events that are happening. I also want to mention our expanding education program. Please look out in the next few weeks for a save the date for our 2025 events, which will have education programming in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Asia Pacific and the United States, of course. So moving quickly to the topic at hand, because I really want to have the majority of the time, both for our presenters as well as those of you attending to ask questions. As you probably are aware, forest management, fire mitigation work, and biochar systems or biochar production are very complementary and overlapping topics with really a huge potential that our speakers from C6 Forest to Farm explored in their recently closed project. In the United States alone, there's an estimated, up to an estimated 18 million tons of non-commercial forestry biomass, or basically essentially any forest residues that couldn't be turned into lumber or other products to sell, that are available to and generated through the necessary forest mitigation work that we need to do to protect these forests and communities from the expanding fires and wildfires. What we'll explore today is the economic, environmental, and social benefits potential from converting this biomass into biochar, but also crucially the headwinds and the impediments that exist to make all of this into a viable economy for biochar in forest management. So I'm pleased now to hand this over to Miles Gray, the Operations Director for the US Biochar Initiative. Welcome, Miles.
Thank you for the introduction, Wendy Lou. And I just want to let everybody know I'm really excited to participate as a moderator in this event. One of the things that's really cool about this project for me is as a resident of the Pacific Northwest, with climate change and with forest management, what we're seeing is more and more wildfires. The future, especially as the world warms, is likely more and more of these fires. And there's really a lot of interest right now at almost every level of government, among the public, to really figure out a way to incentivize forest treatments to reduce fire risk across our landscapes. And biochar has really emerged as a potential approach to doing that. And then beyond that, before I started here at USBI, I worked for a company called Mino Carbon, which is based in Washington State, and they're trying to do a really similar project to what C6 Forest to Farm tried to pull off, which is essentially using a lot of this pre-commercial wood and other wood to create a large biochar industry in the Pacific Northwest, and one that could help sort of incentivize this type of work. So just really excited to hear about the story from C6 Forest Farm. And with that, I'll just give a brief introduction to Mark and Bret, our speakers today, and then I'll hand it over to them to take it away. So Mark was the Director of Finance for C6. He focused on biochar customer discovery, raising capital, unlocking carbon markets, and estimating the financial returns associated with various plant designs and business models. Prior to working at C6, Mark helped launch and lead Expedia Partner Solutions. And he also has more than 20 years of experience in finance and product development, including at Expedia and Amazon. Bret was the Director of Engineering at C6, and he really focused on project management, process development, site evaluations, plant design, layout, and system lifecycle analysis. Prior to working at C6, Bret was a technical lead and discipline team director at Synapse, and he also has an additional 18 years of experience in consumer, industrial, and medical product development. So with that, I will hand it over to Bret and Mark.
Want to go to the next slide, Brett? So just first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining the call. It's fantastic to see all the interest in this topic. I also want to thank the IBI for setting this up and Miles for moderating. Just real quick background on our project. So Brett and I, as Miles mentioned, we work for C6 Forest Farm. C6 was a nonprofit that was started by Tom and Gina McCoy. And the mission of the organization was really focused on wildfire risk reduction. So we wanted to reduce the risk of extreme wildfires and kind of landed on biochar as being the best way to do that. As an organization, we were lucky in that we got some generous funding from the Forest Service, the state of Washington, and Chelan County. And so, you know, Brett, I, and Tom worked on basically setting up a pilot for 2 years. For various reasons, we ended up not pursuing that. And in May, we sort of summarized all of our findings, put those out on our website, which Brett will cover at the end. We returned most of our funding and we ceased operations. So that's kind of a quick summary of the project.
Yeah, and so I thought what I'd do is just give you a little background on the business model and what we were trying to achieve to help frame up some of our takeaways that we'll share as the bulk of the presentation. So our business model really started with buying small trees that come from forest restoration and thinning operations. So these are generally in our region in central Washington, these would be conifers like Douglas fir and ponderosa pine that are less than about 10 inches diameter breast height. And we were planning to take in logs from the small diameter trees. The idea there being that, you know, today logging operations exist in the region, and those operators are very well equipped to handle logs, not to handle the limbs and the tops of the trees and so forth as far as transport goes. So logging operators indicated we should be ready to receive logs up to about 40 feet in length. And, you know, just to kind of add to what Miles was saying, these small trees are the fuel that has sort of grown in over the past century with lots of fire suppression in the West, and they act as ladder fuels for larger trees, and they kind of exacerbate this extreme wildfire risk. We were going to build, as Mark said, a pilot, and the scale of that on the input end is roughly 14 to 15,000 dry tons of wood per year. So if you are more familiar with like reactor, pyrolysis reactor capacities, we were planning somewhere between 1 and 1.5 oven dry tons per hour going into the reactor. And that translates into about 800 log truck loads of green wood each year. And another way to think about it is it's kind of like 1,000 acres of thinning, something like that. So just to give you a sense also of the scale of impact on the problem. And then we were going to pay about $40 per green ton for that material. And the thought there is just that if we could buy the material and inject that revenue into the sort of thinning economics, that would help accelerate the pace and scale of that thinning to impact the wildfire risk. So the plan was to take those small diameter logs and produce engineered biochar with them. And I'll just say here that the biochar was kind of the anchor product of the operation, or that was the plan. So we considered other co-products as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what we thought was that if we could engineer biochar for specific applications, that would be the highest value product that we could make, or product family that would help us pay the $40 per green ton and so have a profitable operation. Obviously, we'd sell those products. Again, for scale, you're talking about kind of 2,400 tons of biochar per year, and the vapor that comes along with that is close to 10,000 tons. And then we would sell offsets, take advantage of the voluntary market there. And our overall objective with all this was to demonstrate a viable business that would justify us scaling the operation at our initial site, and also replicate it to other sites in the region. So, we wanted to show that the operation could be profitable and that it would yield a positive return over the lifetime of the project, or that it would be projected to do so after a couple of years of operation. And the other thing I'll add here, like these numbers are sort of based on a particular plant configuration. We're not going to talk about this in any detail, but in our feasibility study that we delivered at the end of our project, we included something like 9 system configurations. And this is sort of based on one of them in which we would be receiving the logs and doing all of the processing of that. So the way we're going to frame up our takeaways here are sort of the good, the bad, and the unknown. And so we'll start with the good. And what we learned on that is, from a stakeholder perception standpoint, we had great local support. As you can imagine, folks in the West and Pacific Northwest here in particular are really interested in reducing wildfire risk. We live in where the project was going to be is on the east slope of the Cascade Mountains. It's very dry, but there are also a lot of forested areas, and the risk is very, very high. The place where we were targeting to put our plant was in the top priority fire shed for the Forest Service in Region 6, which is Oregon and Washington. So we were right in the epicenter of high risk. People are also interested in the co-benefits that come along with having an operation like this. So folks generally think it makes a lot of sense to apply this forest product lever to help accelerate thinning and risk reduction. The idea of moving excess carbon from our Cascade forests to the major agriculture area in Washington, the Columbia Basin, to amend the soils there really resonated with people. We have a lot of challenges in this region with air quality. So in the spring and fall, it's due to slash pile burning and prescribed burns. And in the summer, obviously, it's due to wildfires. So, with the exception of wintertime in general, and then you have kind of wood stove issues, we kind of constantly have air quality issues. So people want to see some mitigation for that. And then obviously people are always excited to see good jobs coming into their region. The one thing I will kind of add a cautionary note on about this, though, is that folks who have been in the forest management community for 10 or 15 plus years, they've seen hype around these kind of products before, whether it's biofuels or other variations. And so, we got a lot of good inputs from folks in that community, but I think that engagement can be slightly hampered. You have to do a lot of work to convince people that you're really onto something. So, and I think that's a natural reaction to multiple hype cycles over the years.
Yeah, and then another positive, probably not a big surprise to anybody who's in this, is just the carbon markets were going to be a huge tailwind for us. So, if you look at the numbers here, you can kind of see how we build up to it, but we were going to probably be netting $750,000 in annual revenues from carbon offsets. Two quick things to kind of point out. First, so we did a third-party LCA where we followed the Puro standard, and it netted us sequestering 2.7 tons for every ton of biochar. Just want to call it, that does include us, all the transportation of feedstock and the processing. Bret's going to get into the processing more, but it's net of that. So, those are additional emissions that a lot of projects don't have. And then, but to kind of counter that, Bret, whenever possible, used like lower emission electricity driven equipment. So, and then the other thing that caught, you can see we assumed a price of $150 per ton. We did get a lot of feedback from people in the industry that because of the co-benefits and the wildfire mitigation, that we'd have really strong marketing if we were selling offsets. And so there may be some premium that we got above the 150, but obviously things could go either way in the long run. So anyway, carbon markets very strong, especially probably for projects like this that have a lot of co-benefits.
All right, to dive into the bad, probably the major topic here is just how much it costs to pre-process these feedstocks. So again, what we're talking about here is receiving log truckloads of logs and converting them in the pre-processing part of this, converting them into chips that could then be used to make biochar. So not to get any detail here, but this orange box is the pre-processing line as a part of the overall system architecture. And so you can see just in terms of the number of unit operations, it's a huge part of it. And it's also, some of the biggest equipment in the system. To give you a sense of what it might look like, this is like one kind of concept that we drew up for the site we were considering. But you would bring logs in on that sort of deck down on the lower left there is where these logs that are up to 40 feet in length get loaded, and then they would go through this process to be conveyed as chips into the semi trailer that's sitting in that little shed in the upper part of the diagram. So there's a lot of materials handling involved here, and we were planning to include debarking just as a risk mitigation for engineered biochar products to help ensure that they're consistent. So that's a big cost addition, but just to give you an idea of how much this adds to the operation physically. And then, it's just really costly. And one of the big things here is the level of utilization at the pilot scale. So we've got this list of large equipment, and it's large because it's made for high throughput facilities, and because we're trying to take advantage of existing logging operations by receiving the 40-foot logs. So sawmills and chip mills use this type of equipment. I think if you looked at the kind of minimum capacity of this equipment to run at a low level of kind of full utilization, it would be about 3x the capacity of our pilot. So we're just not running this equipment efficiently is the issue at the end of the day, especially given its cost. So it's that list of equipment, it's almost $5 million. And if you think about what that means in terms of the biochar revenue or profit. So we were projecting to sell our biochar somewhere around $650 a ton, depending on a number of factors, but that's a good plan number. The cost of making the chips from logs per ton of the biochar sold is right at about $650. So obviously that's not a viable business approach. But as you can see on the lower right there, we considered the idea of being part of a forest products or biomass campus where this type of equipment would be shared among multiple tenants and be used much more efficiently and at high utilization. In that case, the chips cost like $350 per ton of biochar. So that's obviously a much better position to be in. So on that question of, do you either locate it in an existing mill or within a biomass or forest products campus? I think if you locate an existing mill, which people have done, you can take advantage of that equipment. You have a little bit of flexibility in processing mill residuals, but there's definitely a looser connection to the wildfire risk reduction because a lot of what you're processing comes in intended to be comes in from larger trees that are intended for commercial lumber production or whatever. So that connection is more tenuous. And then more practically, even in our case, in Central Washington, most of the mills have shut down in the last, 20, 30, 40 years. So, and in the kind of a 150 or 200 mile radius of where we wanted to put our mill or put our pilot, there wasn't a mill. So that just wasn't really an option. Chelan County here in Central Washington is looking at building a forest products campus. I think that can be a very viable approach to standing up a biochar pilot as being a tenant in that campus. But then obviously you have to have an entity that is at a higher level managing that campus, distributing resources to the tenants and so on. So that wasn't going to be C6 Forest Farms. So and there wasn't anybody else set up that way in the region at the time either. So, but I'm hopeful that that type of thing is set up in the near future. I just don't know if biochar will be part of the product mix there. Mark?
Yeah, so we talked about how strong the carbon markets are, which is hugely important to the project. But we just kind of wanted to illustrate here that the project couldn't be profitable with offset revenues alone. So what you see on the chart on the bottom is our operating costs are that blue bar. So they were going to be about $2.3 million every year. And, we were going to be generating, or we were projecting we would generate around $725,000 in offset revenue. So those cover kind of a third of your cost. But, that leaves you a big gap, right? And a lot of that is just because of the cost structure associated with this type of biochar operation, right? And then if you look at it, so that's on a profitability basis. And if you look at it on a project returns basis and you build in or you amortize that CapEx expense, then your annual kind of expense goes up considerably, up to like $3.2 million, because the CapEx on the pilot that we had designed was about $13 million, right? So you add that into the operating expense, and now you have a bigger gap, right? So just illustrates the need for additional revenue streams. And then what we did here is just adding in those other revenue streams. So with I would say an optimistic assumption for biochar price point at $650 a ton, that gets you kind of like 1.5 million. And then we looked at, in this configuration, about using the excess heat and vapor to create electricity. And we talked to a few utilities about what we might earn from that if you got $60 a megawatt hour. Net you a bit more, but those are still only kind of 80% of the revenue that you need to cover your OpEx and your amortized CapEx. So it would get you to profitability. So you would cover your OpEx, but it wouldn't get you to a positive project return. And that might be okay, because as you go from a pilot and you add more reactors, you get leverage on your OpEx. So, but this illustrates, that you really need additional revenue streams, right? So the other thing we want to talk about as far as the bad was just what we discovered as far as the biochar markets. So, I guess to start off, we focused on ag markets for a few reasons. They're super close to where we were planning to set operations. We felt like that's where the most momentum was as far as usage of biochar, and it's a great way to move a lot of volume. And to be honest, it farms in our name, so we kind of had to do it. So anyway, we explored, those are the markets we explored. And we kind of followed a pretty standard product development process where we would do customer discovery. We talked to about 25 producers, set up calls with them, meet with them, try to understand their soil health challenges and how biochar might solve problems. Then when there was existing research, we would create a hypothesis, and we really tried to lean into understanding why biochar solved the problem, right? So we could start to think about product formulations and chemistry. And then wherever possible, we'd also create customer ROIs. So we could say, hey, if they're going to make this investment in biochar, which is substantial, what returns would they need as far as higher yields or reduced costs? So we never got to trialing or analysis because we didn't have any physical product. But I guess if you think about product adoption following these stages, right, of awareness and evaluation, and then you go into trialing, and if that works, then you go into adoption. Then we felt personally that biochar adoption was a ways off in Washington State. From those sort of 25 or plus conversations we had with customers, many had heard of biochar. Few knew what it was, and I would say even less than that knew how it could help them, right? So there was some curiosity, but really kind of low awareness. And without any awareness, at least the people we were talking to, they weren't starting to compare how an investment in biochar looked versus their existing solution, right? Now, surprisingly, there was a few folks we talked to who were like, yeah, I might do a small trial. So there was some willingness to do that, but people really needed there was going to be a lot of support, right, that needed to do that. And then you know, some of that is just, we didn't feel like anyone was really ready to adopt. They needed to go through all those stages and really see local trials for their crop in their soils with their growing conditions, ideally on their neighbor's field, right? Before they were willing to make that investment.
On the unknowns, I think, what we'll sort of lean on here is just the potential markets for co-products. So obviously in that vapor stream, there's some potential. I think the highest potential there is in the aqueous fraction of that vapor, of the condensable liquids from the vapor. So essentially the wood vinegar. There seem to be some emerging agricultural applications there. I don't think there's enough data yet to say how these products perform at larger scales, but initial data is promising. And if you think about, given the the configurations we were assessing, this could be 30% of your output mass. And the current retail prices are fairly astronomical based on, I think, very low volumes of production. But, this stuff's selling for roughly $5,000 a ton right now. Certainly a lot of examples of that, or some examples of that. So I think for us, if we were able to capture that, and even considering the additional capex to do that, I think if we could sell it for, I believe it was about $300 to $400 a ton, that would allow our project to break even. As far as a long-term return, if we could sell it for $1,000 a ton, then the project would yield a $33 million return. But that's all pretty speculative. The big thing here is, just like Mark was saying about the biochar, this requires a lot of development in the coming years, all the way from trials and efficacy studies out to trial applications on fields and so on, to get to the adoption level that you would need. The other co-product that we're a little bit hopeful about is electricity. Because we are in a hydropower rich region, our electricity is pretty cheap, and so we couldn't lean on that very hard for revenue, as Mark sort of highlighted earlier. So now, bad news for most people, and maybe good news for the long-term potential on biochar in this region, but the hydropower is being pressured pretty hard from data centers in the region, which are just building more and more of them as the AI movement grows, and then more EV adoption and so on. I think there will need to be additional sources of clean power in this region, and that might open up higher revenue potential for an operation like this. But those are the unknowns to keep an eye on from our perspective. We just wanted to point out that at our website, which will be up for, I don't know, Mark, another 6 months or something like that, maybe.
Another year.
We have a bunch of, we have a bunch of resources posted there. There's like 16 items here posted. You can go dig into our risk log. You can copy it, use it. Requirements, models, CAD, ROI summaries, Mark's financial analyses. That's all there for folks to grab and use and reference. So we invite you to do so. And that's it from us.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark and Bret. I'll now hop into some question and answer session. So I'll start with a few questions that we developed ahead of time, and then anyone else, please add questions you may have to the question and answer tab. We're monitoring the chat a little bit, but we're hoping that most of the questions go into the question and answer tab, and we'll do our best to monitor those, and then I'll flip into some of those questions. So for the first question, and this will clear up a little bit, there's been some questions in the chat. This is about feedstock. So just for reference, the project was intending to get essentially all of its feedstock from wildfire risk reduction thinning work, which is a big part of the wildfire response here in the West. The idea is that you can get rid of some of these small diameter trees, and that reduces the risk to the larger trees, which can typically withstand periodic wildfire, so long as there aren't lots of smaller trees that allow those flames to get up into the bigger trees. So you indicated that the project would get essentially all of its feedstock from small diameter wood derived from these forest health and fire risk reduction treatments. Also indicated that the project was contemplated in an area with very little commercial logging or wood processing remaining. What's the current end fate for material that is derived from these treatments today? That's one part of the question. What accounts for the high cost of these feedstock materials? And have you heard of any state or federal discussions related to things like beneficial reuse incentives for this type of material?
Yeah, great question. I can start, and Bret, feel free to jump in. So I guess like going through those, the end fate. So we were pursuing feedstock that was going to generally end up in slash piles, right? Some of it might have been leveraged for firewood, but vast majority of it was going to be put in a pile. Slash piles are a huge problem. As Bret mentioned, they get burned, they release tons of CO2. And they, a lot of them are done in areas that are near rural communities. So because that's where they're trying to reduce the wildfire risk. So then you're impacting, air quality for those communities. So that was really the kind of the end fate for most of this. I guess as far as the cost, from all our discussions, the actual biomass would be free, right? So the cost was the processing and transportation, right? So no one was going to charge us for the actual trees, but we were going to have to, they were going to have to be processed. So you're going to have to take the limb wood off so that you can put them on a truck. Then, yeah, someone's going to have to put them on a truck, and then the truck's going to have to drive down to our site, right? So, we had discussions with a number of logging operators. We were confident that we could incentivize them to bring this material to us at the $40 per ton, right? And that would vary. Like if there's a project right next to the plant, it might be cheaper, but when you kind of do the weighted average we were thinking like a 25 to 50 mile haul radius, right? That's what it was going to come out to. And I guess, as far as the incentives, like generally everybody that we talk to, they don't want to see this biomass being burned, right? So there's a lot of alignment. Now there are some hoops that you have to jump through, especially with federal government to remove this stuff. But I guess to answer your question, outside the carbon offset revenue that you earn from sequestering this instead of burning it, we didn't find any direct subsidy, at least in our area. We didn't stumble upon that. And I guess the thing that's a bit unfortunate is like burning a pile is actually pretty cheap, right? Let it dry out, you put a little diesel on it, and so there's not even this huge cost avoidance that we can, go back to these guys and say, well, we're saving you so much money by not burning the pile. We looked at that and they're like, yeah, that's there's nothing there. So anyway, we think it's huge as far as reducing improving the air quality. We hope that the cost could be reduced as operators make investments. So maybe that $40 comes down over time, and we hope that there's incentives, but we didn't see anything.
Yeah, great. So a similar question, also related to feedstock. in your feasibility study, you developed estimates for feedstock availability from these forest health treatments. And just as a reminder, that's essentially the source, all the feedstock would come from these forest health treatments. The estimates you presented showed that assuming planned state and federal forest restoration activities were implemented in the area, there would be enough feedstock for the pilot facility, but not an enormous amount more than that. I'm interested in whether you contemplated or investigated whether a facility relying entirely on state and federal forest health treatments to provide feedstock could be financed using private capital, or whether this feedstock scenario would present an unacceptable risk for a bank or another type of finance organization.
Yeah, I think great question. Probably the biggest or second biggest risk associated with the project besides the biochar markets. So I guess not to skirt the question, but we were a nonprofit, so we were focused on public funding and not private capital. So I can't say for sure, but if it was my money, then this would be something that I would want to be heavily vetted, right? So I think, you know, if we were going after private capital, they're going to want some assurances, right? So I guess what we did, just to help everyone understand on the call, so we did 2 forecasts for the volumes. One, we leveraged data from Mason, Bruce, and Gerard, who had done a study for Chelan County on how much small diameter trees were available and could and would be harvested based on current projects, right? And so that was great, directly exactly what we needed. And, you know, based on that, using some really what we think are conservative assumptions on sort of tons per acre, there was going to be enough, right? There's going to be definitely enough if those projects got done. But with any of these federal projects, right, there's risk that they get delayed or that they get revised because of litigation, right? So some things that we thought about to mitigate that risk were, one, start talking to private landowners, right? There's not a lot of volume that you're going to get from a defensible space project, but there are more and more small landowners that own 40-acre plots that are looking to do thinning, right? So that could be a really valuable kind of gap filler, right? If you have problems with some of the federal projects. The other was like what Bret talked about. We wanted to be part of a biomass campus because we felt like if there were a number of people, organizations that needed this biomass, we had a much better, collectively, a much better chance of working to get through some of these administrative hoops that would allow us to remove the biomass and also send a really important kind of demand indicator to operators, logging operators, that they, you know, hey, there's a whole bunch of people who are relying on this biomass. It's worth making some investments and coming to this area, right, and trying to reduce the costs. And then I think the other things that we thought about, we looked into mill waste, right? As Bret mentioned, there's not a close mill, but, you know, worst case scenario, we could have shipped over chips from the west side. And something we didn't look into, but we could have potentially leveraged other feedstocks for a while, right? We're in an ag area where there's a lot of ag waste. So
yeah. Great. Brad, I think the next question is mostly for you. And I'll just say it's clear that based on the conceptual drawings, the pyrolysis system represents only a small portion of the total facility footprint, complexity, capital costs, all of those factors. And I think it's something that, as a prospective biochar company, it can seem like the pyrolysis system itself is the kind of key piece of equipment that's needed. I just am wondering if you can comment on approximately what percentage of the total facility capital cost was represented by the pyrolysis system as compared to the other components.
Yeah, I certainly got caught with that preconceived notion myself early on. You know, obviously it depends on the biomass that you're processing, but for us, the reactor itself was roughly 15% of the overall system cost, and that's full up including site modifications and those types of things as well beyond the equipment. If you include some of the materials handling equipment around the pyrolysis system that you would need regardless, you're gonna need conveyors and some sort of feed bins and this and that, and biochar bin and all that. I think that adds up to kind of like 25% of our overall system cost, maybe a little bit less even. So, and again, that's based on the configuration where we're doing that log pre-processing as part of our own operation. If you're part of a campus or something and you can lop off that $4.6 million, certainly that makes the reactor a much higher portion of the overall system cost.
Yeah, so potentially some major advantages to those sort of campuses, I guess, if they were created and if you could coordinate it properly for that sort of utilization of resources.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. All right. The final question for me before I dive into the other Q&A. You indicated that you encountered healthy skepticism of biochar among farmers and others in the agricultural community. And just before I get into the rest of the question, I just want to point out that Central Washington, where this facility was contemplated, is a really interesting agricultural area with lots of different cropping systems, and a lot of them tend to be fairly high value. Things like apples, potatoes, vineyards, hops. So there are certainly some opportunities here. And so getting back to the question, let's imagine a world where you receive $2 million in grant funding to develop these agricultural markets for biochar in Central Washington, or in Washington State more broadly. How would you spend those funds? Would they be focused on R&D, on pilot projects, on larger demonstration trials, training programs, or something else entirely?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's like super relevant to us because we actually raised about that much money and ended up returning it to our funders. So, yeah, I think, in general, and I'm not a huge fan of this analogy, but it's sort of a chicken and egg situation, right? You can't do proper R&D and large scale trials without a plant. At the same time, you probably don't want to invest and build a plant until you've done the R&D and trials, right? So it's a tough situation, right? I think, Bret and I have talked about this a lot. We really feel like making that investment in targeted product development prior to investing in a plant is the fastest and the highest probability, right? Because, you can spin up sort of a really small R&D thing, plant pretty quickly with modest investment, but you're not going to be producing enough biochar to be doing multiple large scale trials every year, right? Or you could then raise a bunch of money and build a plant that really doesn't solve the problems your customers need, right? And that could take years. You lose a lot of time. So I think we really feel like, doing targeted product development where you're going to need to get the right people. You need to get product development folks, some soil science folks, bioengineering folks, bring them together, focus on the customer. And the other thing, and I know you've said this before, Miles, is the ag markets, there's hundreds or thousands of them, right? And so you've got to pick one or two because it really varies on the soil and the crop rotation and the growing conditions, right? So you got to pick one or two and go deep on those. And then once you've kind of got those product formulations and you've done the trials and you understand the returns that the customers get, I think that's when we feel like it's the right time to invest in a plant. I don't know, Bret, if there's...
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the thing I would underline a little bit is having come from a product development background myself, developing these products and defining the formulations that you would even want to start to do small scale trials on. There's kind of an extra layer of abstraction between okay, I've got a problem that I want to solve for these growers with their soils. Then we point out, okay, what are the attributes of the biochar that you want to create to address those problems? But then you have this kind of chasm between what those attributes are, but then what your feedstock is and how you achieve those attributes. And to me, again, coming from kind of physical product development, that level of abstraction is an additional layer of complexity in the process where you, at least for now, in the future, there may be extensive cookbooks on this stuff that you don't have to do this, but, and I know people like Kristen Tripp are working on this type of thing, but for now, you have to kind of figure out like, what's the transfer from this feedstock via this processing path to get those attributes. And to me, that is a really, really challenging part of the equation. And I would just kind of echo what Mark said about getting the right people on your team to spend this $2 million efficiently through that process.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a good good response, and it kind of echoes some of my work that I did with Mino Carbon, which was doing a lot of the same type of agricultural market development in Washington State. So now an audience question. This is a question from Komalkant Adlak. I may be pronouncing that wrong. The question is related to carbon methodologies for biochar. And this is a question that was bouncing around in my head as well, which is that under many of the existing methodologies, some sort of sustainability certification is required to use feedstock in a biochar facility that generates biochar carbon removal credits. Typically, this is done by either FSC or SFI certification. For reference, my understanding is that the U.S. Forest Service does not implement any sort of sustainability certification for U.S. national forest lands. And I'm wondering if you can comment on whether you looked into this issue and if you had any sort of plan for how to deal with the sustainability requirements associated with this material.
Yeah, I can start. And so we did look into this. We've talked to our representative Perot. We talked to some people who were facilitating Vera, and then we sent that exact question to CAR when their methodology was being formulated, not after it was finalized. So I can't say. The response that we got was that with the assumption that all this biomass was going to be piled and burned, right? That it was eligible feedstock, right? And there wasn't, there really was no concern about the sustainability certifications. I think Perot mentioned that we would need to get some documentation from the Forest Service or the land management organizations, right? That we were going to be leveraging the feedstock from or getting the feedstock from. But I think the real concern was, yeah, what's the end fate for this, right? And it was all going to be piled and burned. And so there wasn't, at least on those initial conversations with federal land, there wasn't concerns about those certifications. But again, I guess the final thing I'd say is we did not take our project to certification. So, you know, I don't want to mislead anybody that that they're home free, but that was at least the feedback we got.
Yeah, great. What I've seen recently is that issue might be getting worked out. Some of these methodologies were developed by European organizations that hadn't had a lot of experience with U.S. national forest lands, but from my understanding, it's getting worked out to some extent. Next question is, when you looked, this is from Diana Doheny, did you look into markets for biochar in stormwater management or soil remediation or soil restoration? And if so, what was your experience in that market?
Yeah, I guess I can start. So we did, at the very beginning, we did an assessment of the markets. You know, did the joke about farms in our name. We did kind of look at all the different segments of where we could go. And I would say that we didn't give those other uses a really deep dive just because of the proximity. And we really felt like the momentum was strong with agriculture, and there was also some mission alignment with our organization. So I would say that, we would read the research and we would talk about it a little bit. We didn't do much on the side of customer discovery, with the one exception maybe of we started to analyze anaerobic digesters, right? And using biochar in that, and we, had a number of conversations with AD operators. So that's sort of like it, a lot of that ends up in agricultural lands afterwards, but that one was the one that was a little different than the rest, right? So, and I think there's a lot of things to work out on that, but that's really exciting because of the subsequent or the presumed growth in ADs and their desire to create more methane, right? Like whatever they can do, they will see that in their bottom line, right? So that was something that I think we were really bullish on that market.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I was working with Mino, we found a lot of potential there. There, as you say, there were some pitfalls around whether or not you're allowed to use biochar as an additive and still get revenue from some of these state fuel tax incentives that essentially create that market. But I think the final question is from Tom Miles, and he says, if I recall, you had a compost producer as a partner who was really enthusiastic about the project. What did that composter perceive to be the value of biochar as an input to his composting? And did you see that as a viable market after kind of coordinating with that producer?
Yeah. So I think, we were lucky enough to connect with a compost producer in the middle of the state that was really progressive and knew a lot about biochar and was like really enthusiastic about it. I think what there's lots of benefits, but if you put it into two buckets of like adding biochar to compost accelerates the composting process and maybe saves them money, and then B, it makes a better product. They were just more focused on it makes a better product, right? So they wanted to sell a product with more carbon, a product with more nutrients, right? And a product that was going to enhance the soil better than their existing, right? And so luckily we were able to connect them with, when we decided to cease operations, with another producer who has subsequently ceased operations, but they got a whole bunch of biochar and they're running trials. And so I hope those do fantastic for them and they can find a new supply.
Yeah, that's great. I know there is continuing to be quite a bit of interest, particularly in the state of Washington. Well, I just want to thank both of you. And before we end, I just want to let everybody know that there is a final report and some really high quality materials that Mark and Bret developed as part of C6. They're on the C6 F2F website. They're really high quality. Highly recommend going and getting them and downloading them from that site. So with that, thank you, Bret and Mark.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Glad we could share what we learned.
Great. And for the IBI team, thank you for putting on this webinar. And I think we're done.